Good morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. And thank you to the leadership of the AANS for giving me the honor of giving the Hunt Wilson Lecture. Today, I'm going to talk about some of my experiences on creativity and innovation in neurosurgery. I've had the privilege of getting to create things within the field, and hopefully I can share some of those learnings with you. So to really start with my disclosures, and these are relevant to this discussion, I've been involved in a number of companies. I've invented a number of things with 600 issued patents, about 1,000 pending. And I think hopefully I can convey some of these things that I've learned along the way. And often these days I'm talking to whether they be trainees, medical students, junior faculty, about kind of what do you want to do as far as innovation in neurosurgery. And my first question to them is always, what is your vision for the future? What is that thing that you are going to commit to in the way that you are going to change the field? And the more you can make that concrete and crystallized, the more likely you are to channel your energies to something impactful. So for me, what was my North Star when I was a resident and an early faculty? And at that time, it was all around this idea of a brain-computer interface. This notion that if we could connect minds to machines, that would transform the field of neurosurgery. Further, I think that it actually has a fundamental implication for the next step in human evolution. I still believe that to this day. And so where I got started was I studied electrocorticography, or signals taken from the surface of the brain, as really kind of an ideal substrate for kind of decoding information and with a low risk of surgical morbidity. So again, some of my early studies when I was a resident, this is getting back 20, 25 years ago, was showing that we could look at amplitude and frequency modulation and show that we could decode movements when people were moving a cursor on a screen. Subsequently, we moved on to showing we could decode elements of speech, we could decode attention, we could decode even levels of consciousness. But this was knowledge and capabilities that were living in the laboratory. They weren't touching patients. And so really, for me, the next step was really, how do we get this to be something that touches patients? And that's where I want to really kind of talk about my second key learning was the importance of markets and the importance of constraints really being vital to creating innovation and new ideas. And so we had these ideas, we had these papers, we had patents that covered them. And so we created this company called Neurolutions back in 2008. And the idea was to create this thimble-like implant that could record signals from the surface of the brain to help people such as with ALS and high spinal cord injury engage and communicate with the environment around them. Now, if anybody remembers 2008, that was a difficult time to raise capital amidst the financial crisis. Also, when we started talking to the FDA, it was very clear that this was going to take us many tens of millions of dollars to translate this solution to a clinically approved device. And so at that time, specifically in history, investors were not interested. High cost of capital to a small market population. So what are we going to do? And so we really had to retool. What is the highest opportunity for motor disability that we can have an impact on? And that's where we really started to think about using brain-computer interfaces in the setting of stroke. Instead of 5,000 to 10,000 patients, it was 1 million patients. And so we also started to really retool our science and came to discover that we could detect signals in stroke patients non-invasively associated with ipsilateral motor movements. And we could use those signals and enable those patients to control a device with their thoughts. And so what we ultimately came up with was this idea of an IPSI hand, taking signals from the uninjured side of the brain to control a robotic exoskeleton that they wore. And importantly, and this was the next step, that by using it, they could remodel neural circuits through Hebbian plasticity to recover function in the chronic phase of stroke. Now, that was an important constraint that led to that idea. This is a non-invasive solution that allows us to create something with a lower regulatory burden and a larger market. Ultimately, here's what the device looks like today. Again, a wearable headset, wearable orthotic. Ultimately, this was the first FDA-approved brain-computer interface. It was given a breakthrough designation It was awarded the Device of the Year in 2021, and now it's helping thousands of patients. Now, another lesson is that idea of using a brain-computer interface to remodel neural circuits. That's a good idea. So I always want to have the discipline of what I call thinking laterally. Take that good idea and use it for something else. And so we learned that we could remodel motor circuits. Then the question became, can we remodel sensory circuits? Or more specifically, can we remodel circuits associated with chronic pain? And so then we created what's called the Theta Hand system. Again, a wearable headset, but instead of a robotic orthotic, we have this very specific vibrotactile device that we created. And basically it reinforces the physiology associated with pain relief. We tested this out in patients with chronic medically intractable pain and showed that we could get pain relief comparable to a narcotic. Taking it one step further, I always want to go through the discipline of, if you've got a good idea, do the exact opposite. What happens if you take the opposite approach of that idea? What does it do, and is that useful for something? And so brain-computer interfaces are real-time with fast physiology. What happens if you go slow? What is interesting about the slowest rhythms in the brain? How can they be used, or the least likely to change? And as it turns out, those are important for brain mapping. And so what we started to look at was resting state fMRI. Slow metabolic signals that are associated with synaptic homeostasis that are very stable, whether you're asleep, whether you're awake, whether you're under sedation, and you can map the entire brain with a single imaging sequence. And so we put on a layer of AI for this before AI was even a thing, around 15 years ago. We showed that we could basically take 12 minutes of data and we could map every segment of the brain using resting state fMRI. So we would create what we call kind of rainbow brains. So we'd map all these areas of the brain according to key functional networks. We've done this in over 3,000 patients at WashU. We've validated this in adults. We've validated this in kids. We've validated this against cortical stimulation and validated it against task-based fMRI. And so all that data taken together ultimately led to kind of an FDA-cleared solution that's now available for neurosurgeons across the country. So again, that was exciting. I really love to see kind of these transitions. Now, one thing, again, getting back to this mentoring notion, is that sometimes I hear kind of, trainees or med students or even faculty say, I'm not a creative person. And my first response to that is BS. That creativity is a skill. This is kind of just like a muscle. This is something that you can train up. Just like we learn to read, we learn to do math, we learn to do neurosurgery, we can be creative. And the more you cultivate that skill, the better it gets. And so on a personal level, again, I've published a number of papers, and that's all well and good. But the larger population around the country aren't aware of these things. And so I thought it was important, again, to both work my creative muscles, is to really ensure that I'm emotionally engaging people around the things that I'm interested beyond neurosurgery and beyond academia. To that effect, I wrote 2 novels, Red Devil 4 and Limbo. I also, with my dear friend and colleague at WashU, Albert Kim, he and I wrote and acted in a play called Brainworks. And that's actually on PBS now, if you ever want to watch that. And sometimes people ask me, well, isn't that kind of a distraction? Doesn't that kind of detract from some of the work you should be doing? And I would argue creativity should be a goal in and of itself. Again, as an analogy, when you look at pro athletes, again, pro baseball players, they should be hitting balls and and catching balls and running around the diamond. But to optimize their performance, they do need to do other things to strengthen those muscles. Basically, whether it's working out in a gym or running on a treadmill. Similarly, we should be doing creative activities to best enable us to perform optimally in our science and in our medicine. Now, this is not a solo sport. It's actually a team sport. And one thing I like to say is that diversity is the lifeblood of innovation. And sometimes these days, diversity has kind of is a loaded term. But what I mean by that is different perspectives, different backgrounds. The more you can bring differences together, it's at those liminal edges that you get the best ideas. And so I have the good fortune of running the Division of Neurotechnology at Washington University. And fundamentally, this is about bringing people together. We have nearly a dozen engineers and faculty physicians who kind of work together and oversee nearly 70 graduate students to basically make new things around neurotechnology. And one of the processes that we have is what are called invention sessions. Again, physicians, they get 2 slides. Show me a problem that you deal with in medicine. Engineers and scientists, give me 2 slides. Show me something that's exciting in your lab, in your field. It doesn't have to have anything to do with medicine. And what invariably happens is nonlinear conversations emerge, and we come up with new ideas that none of the individuals would have come up with by themselves. And that's led to a whole spectrum of solutions ranging from stroke to tumor to epilepsy, really across the board. And that's because of this group dynamic. Now, I've shown you some successes, but I also want to highlight failures. Because in many ways, failure is a gift. It is those moments when we do not succeed that gives us these deep moments of introspection to maybe not see the actual solution, but what the shape of the solution should be. And I want to give an example of that. This came out of an invention session. Here's the problem. Can we take out tumors through a burr hole versus an open craniotomy? So what we created at that time was called the tumor resection device, not a creative name. And I'll be honest, this device failed spectacularly. It did not work. Basically, my lab looked like a zombie apocalypse for a while. But, and this was around 15 years ago, what it did do is prime me for the solution when I saw it. And that was laser ablation, or LIT. And I remember, seeing kind of, a booth before this technology had been FDA cleared and thinking that is what we were going for. And I wouldn't have known that had I not failed, importantly, with some of those devices that I was working on. And so that ended up leading to me doing the first FDA cleared case back in 2010. And I've seen the field grow exponentially, both in publications and number of cases, and I think that's transforming the field. And I've had the opportunity to participate in that because of my failures. Now, again, I'm getting close on time here. What is the most important lesson here when you think about innovation in the field of neurosurgery? People are everything. Let me say that again. People are everything. It's the relationships that you have with people that give you the best ideas. It's the relationships you have with a number of different people that allow you to be most effective in turning those ideas into reality. It's the relationships that you have that make this a joyous process. So, for me, it's my mentors who trained me, the department that I get to work in, and the people that I get to work with, my lab, which is my happy place, the many scientific and clinical collaborators, and the many non-scientific collaborators who've also taught me immensely about what it really takes to take ideas to the real world. Fundamentally, the ultimate North Star for why we do all of this is the patients and their families. And then personally, the reason that I do this is for my family, to make the world a better place for them. So with that, I thank you for the opportunity to talk about these reflections.